welcome back. This is I-24 News Evening Edition. I'm Lucy Arish, and this is the Daily Debate. This month, a 7-year-old girl was taken from her parents' home in Dublin for DNA testing, as the child with blonde hair and blue eyes did not resemble her Roma parents. The girl was, in fact, the biological daughter. The story then sparked international interest, as this past month, European authorities have taken 2 other blonde hair, blue eyes girls from their Roma homes under suspicion of kidnapping, simply because the color difference in their complexions. Joining me tonight to discuss the European attitude towards minority groups are Dr. Raphael Vago from the Department of History at the Tel Aviv University. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. And expert on Eastern Europe, as well as Avi Primor, the former Israeli ambassador to both Germany and the EU and head of European Studies at the Tel Aviv University. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for coming to the studio. So we can say that Europe is still prejudiced?
I don't think so. I think this is a very typical development that you can see in all developed countries, and first and foremost in the United States. Movement of populations, and this is always a difficulty to get used to the area where you live in, and for the people to get used to you who are different from them. But basically, these people are needed, otherwise they wouldn't find jobs in the countries they go to. And this is the major problem. They need work, and the Europeans or the Americans need workers, otherwise it wouldn't function.
So how come Europe gets to this stage that in 2013 you're still being judged by your color of your eyes and the color of your hair, and actually being blamed that this is not your daughter?
First of all, if we discuss the Roma, the Gypsies, of course they are one of the, besides the Jews, the ultimate other in European history and European culture. So unlike the immigrants who are coming to Europe and their work is much needed, as Ambassador Primor mentioned, we are dealing here with a different type of minority. May I mention that at Tel Aviv University we organized a major conference 11 years ago that you were so helpful at that time to organize it, about the Roma, and the book came out about this. And in that conference, we discussed a very interesting aspect, that the Roma are the best clients of the European Union. Why? Because the Gypsies, I'm using the term now, Roma, have always been borderless. They've always been nomadic. Thus, a borderless Europe works on their favor. Now, not everybody likes this favor, that it works on their favor, because having a Romanian or Bulgarian passport, and we're dealing with much of the Roma problem in Western Europe, with Roma coming from Bulgaria and Romania. Most of the problems in Italy and France especially are coming from that area of Eastern Europe, the Balkans. These people have European passports, they can move freely, and the problem from some of these countries is how to cope with this type of immigration, how to accept or not to accept them, and how perhaps to reject them and to deport them, as President Sarkozy has done it exactly 3 years ago.
But it's not just accepting or not accepting in the political way of thinking about this, but it's also something in the education and something that actually grown-ups still look at the way that we look. Because if we're taking a child and we think that because of the child is blonde hair and blue eyes and doesn't look similar to her parents, and we judge that they kidnapped her, what does it say about our society? What does it say about...
I don't think this is so. I don't think that today it's still a matter of physical looks. Because if you look at the European population today, not to speak about the American one, there's such a mixture of races, colors, origins, and religions as well. But basically, you look at a street in London, look at a street in Paris, look at a street in Berlin, you see Africans, you see people originate from the Arab world, or from India, or from China. Same goes to the United States, of course, even more. People have gotten used to this. This is not an issue anymore. The problem with the child, with the Roma, with the Gypsies, you're talking about is a problem of culture, not of color, not of race. The Gypsies are being accused of being thieves, of having a tradition, a culture.
Stereotypes.
Yes, stereotypes, and there's probably some truth in it because they're nomads, so very often they have no means to survive and they have to steal, and maybe they have this tradition. I'm sure that this is only a minority among the Gypsies, but it's a stereotype and it's typical for them in the eyes of the population. So it's not a matter of race or color. Now, when you see a child that looks strange in this environment, you say, oh, they are thieves. They probably stole her. That's the problem, not the color.
So let's try to look at the specific situation. Let's look at ourselves, like in Israel. We have here a lot of minorities inside Israel. Maybe the biggest minority is the Arab minority. What is the difference between the treatment of Israel towards minority than in Europe and the United States?
First of all, in the Israeli case, or the Middle Eastern case, we do not have minorities who are new immigrants like you have in Europe. So I think that in Europe we have to distinguish, and not only in Europe, of different categories of minorities. And of course, we may have a historical problem from a social science perspective, how to define a minority. It reminds me that one of the major discussions in solving the crisis in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, one side say to the other, why should I be a minority in your country? Why shouldn't you a minority among my majority? So it's who is the majority and who is the minority. So in the Israeli case, we have populations living here for hundreds of years. And of course, we have the competitive narratives, as we know very well, who came first and when. But in Europe, we have, first of all, new waves of immigration, as we have mentioned. And among the local minorities, who have been always shifting, their fate has been shifting because of the changing borders. So sometimes you have huge minorities, very large minorities, who are one side of the border, and without moving an inch from their house, they found themselves the next day in another country. So then is the problem of the borders. Again, I'm emphasizing a borderless Europe, which is not perfect. It doesn't work perfect. It deserves a special discussions about it. But the borderless Europe, in one way, it tries to solve the problem of minorities. Because if you can cross the border, so why should you worry that a part of my nation or my ethnic group is beyond that border? Let me just a very brief example, yes, among dozens or hundreds. There is a very long border between Hungary and Slovakia. I passed it a couple of weeks ago. And there's a large Hungarian minority in Slovakia that sometimes was nationalist, is seen sometimes as a hostile minority by the Slovak authorities. But when the border is open, on the river Danube, among the other, near the town of Komárom in Hungarian, you can cross the border whenever you want and how do you want. So then the problem of minorities is a little bit shifting away from the...
So it's basically what is happening right now in Israel when the borders were open, and the problem with the migrants that came from Sudan and Eritrea, and it's basically the same because the border was open, people came into Israel, and now the Israeli society is finding it very hard to cope with these people inside Israel.
When they concentrate in one particular area and the dimensions vary between the parts of the population. But why would these people come? They have not discovered a vision concerning Israel. They thought they could find work here. They want to survive. They need work, that's all. And people in Israel wanted, many of them wanted to have them. They can protest against the presence of migrants, but personally they would very much like to work with them because they're cheap and they're good workers and they need them, but otherwise they shouldn't be any of them.
And they do the work that maybe Israelis are too spoiled to do.
Right, but this is typical for the developed world all over. Same goes for Europe, same goes for the United States. Look, many of those who vote for Marine Le Pen in France vote against migration, vote against foreigners. This is the slogan that attracts most people to vote for this party. Yet, these are people who have small businesses and very often engage and hire migrants who are even illegal in France. So in my little factory, I want to have illegal immigrants because they're cheap and they work well. I don't want to see them elsewhere, you see? So if the governments would have the courage to work and to struggle against those who grant jobs, not against the migrants. The migrants wouldn't come. But these are your voters. You need them for the elections, so you don't do anything against them, you do it against the migrants.
You know, this brings me, there is a phrase in Arabic that says, "Man 'ashara qawman 40 yawm sara minhum." If you lived with a society for 40 days, you become one of them. But it doesn't actually like that.
The Jewish answer would be for 40 years.
For 40 years. Yeah, and we're talking in Arabic phrase for 40 days.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually...
The problem is even worse. Look, if you take a country like France, and France is really the best example you can have. The French, since many, many years, have tried to create one single nation, one single society. They didn't care about race, about origin, about color, about religion. Everybody was French, and you had no right to mention his origin anywhere or his religion. And you have a national schooling system, all have the same education, the same culture, and then they're all one nation. Who torpedoes this program now? The migrants themselves. The various peoples who have come one generation ago, 2 generations ago from other countries, want to have their own schooling system. The Jews want to have Jewish schools, and the Muslims want to have Muslim schools. And so they prevent the French government from creating one nation and for really creating a one single standard.
So they're not actually integrating with the society inside, and they're not actually, but they want to be a part of the society, but the society of the majority is not letting them actually feel at home. So this is a problem that, how can you solve this? How can you actually
I agree with you very much. I do not have a solution that you're asking for, but a remark. One of the major problems with immigrants and minorities is how much they take up the values of the local societies or integrate what we have been discussing. And it's very difficult also to define what does it mean to integrate into what. What is the French idea coming from the French Revolution's famous Declaration of August 1789, Declaration of Men and Citizens. How do you integrate into one body, and what will be the outcome of this integration?
And you don't lose yourself in the process.
Exactly. So again, I'm taking the Roma example, which are not new immigrants, that don't coming from Africa. They have been Europeans for more than 1,000 years. On the one hand, the Roma are being pushed by the modern society, civil society, to keep their identity and to foster their identity and culture. The more you do that, and there is a paradoxical aspect here, they do not integrate into society because someone pushes them to remain Roma. Another aspect is that some of their leaders, as it happens many times with minorities, specifically with problematic minority, it could be religious and other ethnic and other minorities, their leaders are making a good living out of the misery of their crowd. And this I have observed among the political attitudes and the political activism of some of the Roma, young Roma, who kind of mafia type of leaders, I am generalizing very much now, are taking over the interests of the group, the community, in representing them. And in fact, they're making quite a too much good living out of it. So there is also a problem of the leadership of those communities and how much they want to cling to their identity, and what does it mean to integrate into what, how, and with what speed to integrate into the other societies.
Now, I want to open, Mr. Primor, this big subject of Islamophobia in Europe, but in one sentence, do you think that it is a problem that can be solved in the next few years?
Let's not lose proportions. Most of the migrants integrate. Most of them do. They go to school, and afterwards they want to be part of the nation because they want to advance in life. And being segregated and living in a ghetto is not good for them personally. So the masses of Muslims in Europe do integrate. The masses of Turks in Germany, of Pakistanis in England, of North Africans in France, they do integrate. And so do the Jews, by the way. But you only hear about the hard nucleus of those who do not integrate. And they are the ones who make the headlines.
The headlines, like always. Yeah. Mr. Avi Primor, thank you very much for this. And Raphael Vago, thank you very much for this discussion. And we're going out for a small break, 10 minutes break, an update from our news desk. And then we're back. Don't go anywhere.